Right by Them, Chapter 5, written by Esperosis and read by Ibis Podfic. This was the absolute last thing John wanted to be doing at 7 in the morning, and the absolute last place he wanted to be doing it in. The only solace he got was that he was positive Elias felt the exact same way. He didn't physically need to feed on the suffering of others yet, but knowing Elias hated the now 10-minute lecture on building safety and fire codes as much as he hated giving said lecture made him feel better. And don't even get me started on if there happens to be a fire in another department, John continued to ramble. I know for a fact artifact storage has at least one fire daily. What if one of those was to get out of control? Artifact storage is the closest department to the archives. We could lose so many documents to both the fire and water damage. John was hardly even paying attention to what he was saying anymore, just allowing himself to get lost in the flow of a good rant. It had been a while since he had done this. Well, technically, he had ranted to Tim and Sasha about the importance of proper citation a month and a half ago, but that simultaneously felt like a month and a half and over 3 years ago, so he tried not to think about it that much. Elias pinched the bridge of his nose. John, I already talked to Sasha and Tim about procuring grants for this sort of thing. Did you know they offer grants for fire safety improvements for old buildings such as these? John, I'm not exactly sure what the cutoff is when it comes to how old a building needs to be, but the Magnus Institute has stood for nearly 200 years and... John! Elias raised his voice slightly, snapping John out of his rant-induced daze. John's mouth snapped shut, and he went slightly red despite himself. I can see that you're rather passionate about the sprinklers, Elias gave John a strained smile. And you've brought up some excellent points. I'll look into it. Right, John nodded, fiercely suppressing all negative thoughts before they could arise. I appreciate that, Elias. Of course, Elias's smile turned slightly more genuine, even as it made John's skin crawl. I'm just happy to see my new archivist is already working so diligently and is thinking toward the future. How are things going, by the way? Any problems? He asked. John forced himself to remain calm and neutral as possible in both body and mind, as his thoughts immediately went to the anglerfish statement and its problems. Well, aside from the dog, there was one thing, John spoke. Ah, yes. I'm sorry about Blackwood again, Elias apologized. I really thought for certain I had sent you an email about him, but, well, technology doesn't really work all that well in the archives, unfortunately. John nodded. It's no problem, he replied. He's an excellent addition to the team. I'm glad to hear it, Elias nodded. Now, what was the other thing you wanted to mention? John hesitated. It's one of the statements. It's not a recording digitally. Elias raised an eyebrow in fake surprise. Not recording? No. My assistants and I tried on all of our laptops. It just wouldn't record, John explained, forcing himself to breathe calmly and slowly. Did you try turning your computer off and then on again? Elias asked. I've heard that's a good fix for technical issues. Jonathan suppressed his eyes twitch at that as he took a deep breath. Yes, we tried that. And we unplugged and re-plugged in all our equipment and tried switching them around in all the different plugs. I assure you, Elias, we tried everything we could think of. Elias hummed, considering. He then sighed. I'll put in a word with IT about it. See if we can't get you some better equipment. For now, just try whatever audio recording devices you have available, I suppose. Like a tape recorder, John thought, unable to suppress it. Right, we'll just, keep trying, I suppose. Good, Elias replied. Was there anything else? Why are we transcribing the statements to audio? John asked, before he could shut his mouth. He mentally kicked himself. He had been doing so well, so goddamn well, to keep the eventual thoughts at bay and to just shut up, get the CO2 sprinklers, and get the hell out. Why did he have to say something like that? If Elias thought the question was odd, he didn't show it. Well, simply put, the archives are a complete disaster. I'm certain, given time, you will be able to sort things out. However, as technology progresses, I find more and more work is being done exclusively digitally. So it only makes sense that the archives are recorded digitally as well. That way, students and researchers have better access to it, and it means that the data isn't lost in case of, well, fire or water damage from old sprinklers. Elias ended with an indulgent smile that made John want to rip both his and Elias's eyes out of their sockets. Instead, he bit down his disgust and smiled back at the only person he hated more than himself. Does that make sense? Now, if there wasn't anything else, Elias asked. No, I don't think so, John replied as he began to shuffle towards the door. I'll just get going. Lots of work to do. Do take care of yourself, John, Elias called after him as John left. John remained silent, letting his mind be as calm as the surface of an icy lake. Thought of nothing. Nothing at all. Soon he arrived at the entrance of the archives. He slowly and silently opened the door, stepped through, and closed it just as gently. He stood at the top of the stairs down to the archives for a few moments before he finally let himself burst. He gritted his teeth and buried his hands in his hair as he resisted the urge to scream his head out. Fucking Elias, fucking piece of shit, Jonah fucking Magnus, he seethed. That bastard was so brazen with everything. He knew exactly what he was doing. All those little comments and smiles and bullshit. Bringing up Martin as soon as he mentioned the dog, even though John had never even put those two in the same fucking sentence. He wanted to stab him to death so badly. Once wasn't enough. He worried about his mental health when he realized that he knew exactly how Melanie felt back in his original timeline. John finally released his fingers from the iron grip they had on his hair before taking a deep breath, desperately trying to collect himself. He did his best to fix his hair, which was sticking in odd directions due to his pulling, and make sure he looked presentable for when his assistants arrived. John turned and was a moment from beginning to walk down the staircase before he realized he heard voices from further into the archives. He hesitated for a moment, surprised his assistants had arrived so early. Usually, Tim wouldn't be caught dead in the institute before 9 at the earliest, and when John glanced at his phone, it showed it was still 7:14. Yet, it was definitely Tim's voice he heard, followed by Sasha and Martin's. John frowned at how early they had come in, but decided to leave it for later and hope it didn't become a habit, when he realized they were talking about him. I mean, Martin's voice echoed, I suppose you two would know him better since you're, friends? Yeah, Tim replied, and John could hear the grin on his face. John, Sasha, and I go pretty far back. I basically bullied John into being friends with us when he first started here. He was not happy about it, Sasha chuckled. You should have seen the looks he gave Tim, Martin. You would have thought you insulted his mother's cooking to his face when Tim recommended he get a better work-life balance. He's like a cat, Tim laughed, all grumpy and temperamental, but secretly he's just a big old softy looking for belly rubs. John felt his face heat up at the comparison, but he didn't have time to dwell as Martin began talking. Yeah, that's what I heard, the temperamental and grumpy part, not the belly rubs. I mean, I heard he was like a really big asshole. When I said I was going to work under him, I actually got some condolences. Martin laughed nervously. It wasn't really encouraging, but he's not like that at all. He actually seems pretty nice. I mean, don't get me wrong, he is an asshole, Sasha hummed, but he's a nice asshole, if that makes sense. No, Martin replied. He's our asshole, Tim added, not really helping. It's like, Sasha tried to explain, he'll get really, really on your ass about something, but it's not because he's trying to be mean. It's more like he knows you can do better, and he hates it when people do worse than he knows they're capable of. Oh, Martin audibly swallowed, and John thought back to Martin's fake CV that said he could do a lot more than he was actually capable of. He also really hates it when people are just straight up awful, Sasha added. Tim cut in. You have no idea how many times he got on dude's case about acting like an ass to Sasha. The HR complaints, Tim burst out laughing. Do you remember that time John told that one guy that he could critique your research skill when he learned how to cite a source better than an illiterate primary schooler? John could practically hear Tim crying as he laughed, Sasha quickly joining him. John suppressed a sigh at the memory, one of those vague yet clear memories from before he took over this John's body. He also remembered how this led to his citation rant to Sasha and Tim while they waited in HR for his write-up. John massaged the bridge of his nose. He really had no control over his mouth back then. He suppressed the urge to sigh again as he realized he hadn't exactly improved in all this time. I think I understand, Martin finally piped up as Tim and Sasha's laughter began to die down. But still, he just, I don't know, seems a little different from what I've heard, and even from how you're describing him. If he was like that, would he have gotten on my case yesterday? Probably, Sasha agreed. But John's... She trailed off, and silence hung over the archive for a few moments before Tim continued, his voice serious. John's been having a hard time lately, Tim explained. He's been having some nightmares, and I think he had some kind of nervous breakdown a month ago. Just kinda hit his limit, I think. Oh, Martin replied. John hated the way he sounded so sad and concerned. Yeah, did you know he didn't even apply for this position? Tim continued. What? Martin nearly gasped. But I thought the applications were pretty competitive. They were. I was watching. I actually applied, Sasha explained. But then, the other day, John gets called into Elias's office and pressured into accepting the position. It was awful. You should have seen him. He was really stressed about not knowing what to do, and he was worried we were going to hate him. That's awful, Martin's voice sounded so heartbroken it made John's chest ache. Why would Elias do that? Our best guess? Tim's voice was strained. This place is a mess, and he just wants someone who knows will work himself into an early grave to get it in order as quickly as possible, which is why we're not going to let that happen. Sasha made an affirmative noise. John has a terrible work-life balance, and this place is an actual nightmare. And that's putting aside that whole digitizing bullshit Elias has been doing on top of it. So we're going to make sure that he takes care of himself. Help as much as he'll let us. Which is why we're here so early, Tim explained. But why are you? Oh, I just wanted to make a better impression? Martin hesitated in that way John knew likely meant he was fidgeting with his jumper in that way that made him look adorable. You know, because of the dog. And John's reputation. I don't think that'll be an issue, Marto. Tim's grin was audible. Oh? Martin asked. I go by many names and many titles, you see, Tim spoke. But none I wear as proudly as the coveted title of John Whisperer. John suppressed a groan as he rolled his eyes. And I can tell you that our boss man has warmed up to you especially quickly. What? Martin asked before his voice suddenly started quietly. You think so? Really? Really, Marta, Tim replied. You're a very likable guy. Maybe we'll get the bright ray of sunshine for our skunkly cat's gloomy day. Without thinking, John grabbed the doorknob to the archives and loudly opened the door. He had to stop the conversation right now. He couldn't let Tim psych Martin out and ruin John's chances with the love of his life. He waited for a second or two before loudly shutting the door. He was met with blissful silence. He began to walk down the stairs at a normal volume, attempting to seem casual and not at all like he was blushing. He cooled his features into neutrality, and was pleased when the heat receded from his cheeks before he laid eyes upon his friends and, hopefully, future husband. You're all here rather early, John greeted them. I don't think any of you are scheduled to come in for another hour. Not that he minded. It just sounded like the three of them were planning on overworking themselves for John's sake, and he really didn't want to pass them that particular habit of his. Tim grinned. Pretty sure you're not supposed to be here till 8 either, boss man. Yes, well, John averted his eyes. I had a meeting with Elias. And we had a meeting with you about your meeting with Elias, Tim continued, and John sputtered. I didn't. And would you look at that? Tim gasped in fake surprise. Seems like we're having it right now. John looked at Tim's smirking face, dumbfounded for a few moments before letting out a long and tired sigh. Right then, I suppose I'll start our meeting. John emphasized the last word while staring at Tim. Tim's smirk only grew in response. Elias is going to look into replacing the sprinkler system, and he is putting in a word to IT about getting us some new audio equipment to record statements with due to the difficulties with case 0122204. For now, he recommended we just use whatever audio recording devices we have available, see if anything works. Did he say anything about the audio recordings and why they're important? Sasha asked, the picture of innocence, even as her earlier comments bounced around in John's head. Yes, I did mention that actually, John replied. He said that, since the physical archives are such a mess, and most things are done digitally nowadays anyways, it would be much more convenient for everyone involved if you had all of the files backed up electronically. Also preserves them in case of damage. Tim's eye twitched, and he and Sasha exchanged a look. I do apologize for the expanded workload. Not your fault, Tim cut off as he stretched back into his chair. If Double Boss wants it done, then we'll get it done. Right, John nodded. If any of you need me for anything, please let me know. Will do, Sasha agreed, and Tim gave him a 2-finger salute. Martin mostly avoided John's gaze, and John felt his heart pang with grief at the distance between them. There was nothing to be done about it yet. He would just have to gradually close the gap before asking Martin out. If he rushed it, he might scare Martin away. Genuinely, he was more terrified of that than the apocalypse happening again. John gave a stilted nod once more to the three before walking into his office door, making sure the door was wide open for them. John had always found losing himself in his work to be relaxing. He could turn off all the terrible thoughts running through his mind about apocalypses and losing his humanity and evil bosses and just work. It was tedious, mind-numbing, boring, such a wonderful distraction, John nearly found himself weeping over the paper. The only thing that made it better was the background noise of his friends talking to each other. He couldn't make out what they were saying, wasn't paying enough attention, but just hearing Sasha, the real Sasha, joking with a Tim that wasn't blind with rage, and a Martin that hadn't had so much taken from him. It was indescribable. He didn't know if there was a God. There wasn't one he was ever able to see. But just being able to be here again among the people he cherished more than anything, perhaps there was some divine merciful being out there after all. Lost in his work and their voices, he didn't realize exactly what was happening until Tim exclaimed, "Oh, thanks, Martin. This is amazing. You've got to teach me how to brew tea like this sometime." Martin was making his tea round, his first tea round in this timeline. John felt his heart finally settle into a steady, much too fast rhythm. Martin was going to bring him tea. He was going to come in here, bring him tea like he used to, and John was going to have to somehow not burst into tears. He was in heaven. This really was heaven, with Tim and Sasha and Martin and his wonderful tea. John tried to keep his breathing steady as he anticipated Martin's arrival. Tim left his desk for some reason as Martin walked towards Sasha. But wait, would Martin bring him tea? Maybe he shouldn't assume. It wasn't like things were going to be the same way they did last time. Martin said himself this morning John was a lot different from what he expected. Oh God, what if Martin didn't like him because he was being an awkward mess around him? While they were in Scotland, Martin never told him exactly when his crush on John had started, but he had mentioned that John was rather attractive when he was rude. Something about the look on his face with fire in his eyes or something. But John wasn't doing that. What if Martin wasn't attracted to him? What if he never saw John as hot and then developed feelings for him? Had he ruined everything already? John's blood pounded in his ears and his eyes prickled as his mind ran through hundreds of different scenarios where Martin never fell in love with him. What if he went out with Tim instead? Tim was objectively better looking, and he knew Tim liked men. What if... "Hey, John?" Martin knocked on his open door, snapping John out of his spiraling thoughts. "Yes?" John stuttered, shaking slightly. "I brought you some tea if you, Martin blushed. "I know you don't really ask for any. Well, I thought you might like some." All of John's negative feelings were swept away as his mind was filled with admiring how pretty Martin looked when he blushed. John felt a smile pull at his lips, and he didn't even attempt to resist it. God, Martin was so handsome. How had he ever managed to get so lucky? Martin glanced around nervously, and John suddenly realized he had forgotten to answer. Oh, yes, of course. Thank you, Martin." He stood up from his desk and walked over to Martin, taking the cup from his hands and taking a long sip. "It's wonderful," he sighed happily, letting himself get lost in the taste for a moment as pleasant memories floated like clouds through his mind. Martin squeaked, his face bright red as he looked down at John. I'm really glad you like it." John felt his heart drop. Had he made Martin uncomfortable? Oh, God. He had sworn to himself he'd take this slowly and not scare Martin away. But now Martin's face was bright red, and he couldn't even look at John, and John had made him uncomfortable. God damn it, could he do anything without messing it up? He opened his mouth to apologize, but Sasha beat him to it. "Good, you're up. It's lunchtime, John." She walked towards them. "Tim's got everything set up in the break room, and we can thank Martin for his delicious tea to drink." John looked down at his watch, finding it was already noon. I didn't actually bring anything to eat," he admitted. "Tim figured, so he made extra of his lunch for you," Sasha grinned. "Now come eat, or I'll have Martin drag you into the break room." What? Me?" Martin sputtered, and Sasha just grinned at him. "That wouldn't be necessary. I'm coming." John took another sip of his tea before he held it close to his chest, and the three of them made their way to the break room where Tim had set up the break room table. There were only 2 chairs for some reason, so Tim had set up the table next to the couch with John and Martin, having to sit next to each other where he and Sasha took chairs. John was fairly certain this was intentional and bit down the urge to tell Tim off for it. Martin was already uncomfortable with how John was acting. He was his new boss, after all, and was acting like a total idiot around him. He was certain Martin wouldn't want to be so physically close to him. However, luckily, Martin didn't seem to mind and took the whole thing in stride, even as they occasionally bumped into each other and their arms brushed. Every piece of contact set John's body alight as he desperately tried to hide his blushing with his well-timed sips of tea. "Oh, John was so mad. You should have seen it, Martin." Tim continued his story as John shook his head. "He and David got into a huge bloody row in the middle of the office floor. David was so mad John was acting like a child about one little assignment, but John absolutely refused to. Wasted time on a stupid old box when he had everyone else's jobs to do, apparently. Tim was cackling at this point, and Sasha snorted. Even Martin was giggling as John pinched the bridge of his nose, barely suppressing his smile. I think he called the whole thing a bunch of bullshit at one point, Sasha wheezed. I thought for certain both of them were going to get sacked when Elias walked in and told both of them to come to his office immediately. Martin's eyes widened as he turned to John. Did you get in trouble? Just a bit of scolding, John sighed. He was upset at me for escalating and David for not de-escalating. Told both of us this was a research institute, for Christ's sake. He put on an exaggerated impression of Elias's voice that left Tim sputtering out some of his tea. And we needed to act like adults. Martin laughed at that, his eyes crinkling in a way that sent a butterfly through John's entire body. The man practically glowed beside John, and John found himself needing to avert his gaze and bring his empty mug to his lips before he did something incredibly stupid. Sasha wiped tears from her eyes. It was David's fault, really. Everyone knows that Johnson Sims doesn't work with spiders. I seemed to mellow Martin out a bit, as his expression more from amusement to curiosity. You don't like spiders? No, John shook his head as he took another bite of the pulled pork Tim brought him. Nasty little creatures. I have what most people would call arachnophobia, I suppose. You suppose? Tim smirked at him. I found you on your desk one time in research. Said you had been there for 20 minutes because there was a spider between you and the door, and you were waiting for me to come back. John just shrugged. I don't like them. Why not? Martin asked, so blissfully ignorant it made John's chest hurt. I actually kind of like spiders. They're cool. And they don't want to hurt you or anything. Just help you out with flies and other pests. They do a lot of good work for the ecosystem. It's, John trails off as he tried to think of the words. You're well right about all of that. But it's more, it has to do with something that happened a really long time ago. I don't really like to think about it. John saw as Tim's eyes immediately lit up with recognition, but he wasn't sure why. Sasha glanced at him, but Tim was already talking, his voice loud and jovial in that tone that likely only John and Sasha knew was forced. So, Martin, how are you settling into the archives? He asked, and Martin's eyes immediately snapped over to him. I know you were a bit nervous. I mean, John, Sasha, and I go pretty far back, but I just want to make sure that you know you're always welcome in our little trouble. Trouble? John muttered under his breath. Oh, Martin's cheeks flushed a bit pink. It's really nice so far. You're all a lot more welcoming and friendly than they were at the library, which is nice. Because I was a bit worried at first because Martin's mouth snapped shut and he glanced at John nervously. John sighed and smiled gently at Martin. It's all right, Martin. I know I have a bit of a reputation. Well earned, likely. But I'm trying to turn over a new leaf, so to speak. Oh? Sasha asked as all turned to John. Yes, well, Sasha and Tim. I'm sure you both noticed my little incident a bit over a month ago. It's put a lot of things into a new perspective. I just realized I was focusing on the wrong things, and not focusing on what was really important to me. He gave a strange smile. I was putting too much effort into being someone I, frankly, didn't even like. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to be better, do better. The table was quiet for a moment before Tim broke out into a wide grin. I don't even have a joke for that, buddy. I'm just really happy for you. Me too, Sasha smiled at him. Let us know if there's anything we can do to help you on your journey to self-improvement. Maybe just tell me if I'm being too much of a prick. John raised an eyebrow and Tim barked a laugh. Consider it done, buddy. Shortly after, Tim suggested they play a few rounds of 2 truths and a lie. John barely managed to settle everyone down again. 5 p.m. rolled around much quicker than John thought it would. We're heading out, John. Are you coming? Sasha asked, holding on to the doorframe as she leaned to the side, peering into John's room. I'm going to stay a bit late today. I just want to get a bit more sorting done before tomorrow morning. Sasha raised an unimpressed eyebrow. I won't make it a habit, I promise, John sighed. Just for tonight. I'm going to hold you to that, she replied, straightening up and heading to her desk, letting Tim and Martin know he wasn't coming. Don't work too hard, old. Tim cut himself off and cursed. Wait, no. You're younger than me. Damn it, John. Now all my old person jokes are ruined. I'm sorry, John replied, his voice flat. He didn't even bother to look up from the page in front of him. You better be, Tim huffed and sadly muttered to himself. Sasha grinned and rubbed a circle into his back as they both loitered around their desk for a few moments. John was about to risk asking them what was wrong before Martin suddenly appeared at his office door, mug in hand. Here, he said, slightly out of breath. For if you're staying late, he placed the mug of tea on John's desk, smiling nervously at it as his cheeks flushed. John's heart swelled, and he had to resist the urge to grab Martin's face and kiss him senselessly. Thank you, Martin, he spoke instead, pouring as much genuine affection as he felt he could without scaring Martin off. Martin went a bit redder, and it was such a privilege that John could make him turn that beautiful shade. He suddenly remembered that he wasn't supposed to be scaring Martin off, and averted his gaze, catching Tim and Sasha looking at each other suspiciously from over Martin's shoulder. Well, have a nice evening. Martin kept his eyes on his shoes. You as well. John similarly refused to look at Martin. As Martin left the room, John looked back up to watch him leave, only to see Sasha and Tim staring at John, smirking. John felt himself flush slightly and returned his gaze to his paper, keeping his head down until he heard the three of them leave. He then let his mind refocus on the work in front of him. He worked for hours like that, just mindlessly filing and throwing things out, biding his time. What he was doing was important. Well, as important as any of this bullshit was. But that wasn't the point. The point was to be a busy little worker bee until Elias either fell asleep or got bored of watching. He couldn't feel his gaze, couldn't tell yet when Elias was watching him, so he had to run the clock and hope it ran long enough. He glanced at the clock. 11 p.m. John finished putting the last fake statement into a manila folder and closed it on his desk. He slowly stood and carefully made his way across his office to the floorboard in the back corner, the one that squeaked far too loudly. He crouched down by the floorboard and hesitated. What he was doing right now was suspicious, but if he lifted the floorboard, Elias would know for certain he was working with Gertrude and would look through his mind and see, well, everything. It would be game over. Yet, he had to take the risk. Gertrude told him she would plant explosives in case her plan didn't work. She told him she'd hide them in her office, his office, so if the detonator was anywhere, it was here. He had to know. He had to know if the detonator was here, because if it was... Lunch flashed in his mind once more, their smiling faces, the crinkles around Martin's eyes as he laughed, how Tim's gaze sparkled as he spun his stories, Sasha's knowing eyes as she called Tim out on his lie during their game. John hesitated. He took a deep breath, curled his fingers around the end of the floorboard, peeled it upwards. Inside lay Gertrude's laptop, the key to her storage closet, and a mass of cobwebs. John wasn't sure if he was grateful or furious with the web for taking the detonator, and likely removing the explosives as well. On one hand, it was an easy method of solving everything gone. On the other hand, John was so very tired of having to make these impossible choices. A sense of peace came over John as he placed the floorboard back over the secret compartment, stamping down on it for a good measure. He sighed in relief as he gathered the files back into their box and hefted it up, putting his arms under the box and balancing it against his chest. He carefully made his way to document storage, where they were dumping quite a few of the partially sorted boxes. He had planned to dump the box in a corner and head home. He had planned to take the last tram back to his neighborhood and go to sleep. He had planned to leave all of this behind for tomorrow and slip into pleasant dreams of Scotland and his research days. He hadn't planned to find the tape recorder, sitting in a cracked, open file box, wrapped in a purple bow and cobwebs, with a brand new tape recorder. John felt his blood turn to a frigid ice as he tentatively nudged the box open, silky thread snapping as the lid moved easily. It sat there, a gift, so obviously for him, even if not directly addressed. Its perfectly tied bow almost mocking him. He could ignore it, he supposed, or he could throw it away, light it on fire, or crush it under his heel. He could turn a blind eye to anything and everything until it came toppling down on him. It was a trap, so obviously a trap that any attempt at subtlety was thrown directly out of the window, it seemed. This was blatant, deliberate, and John felt himself sneer at the sheer absurdity that they thought that he would touch that thing with a 10-foot pole. There was a note under it, he suddenly realized. The slightest corner of the purple paper poked out innocently from under the tape recorder. He really should just burn the entire box. He tentatively reached forward, prepared for, he wasn't sure, Spider to emerge from between the files, the tape recorder to bite him, Annabel Kane herself to burst out from the wall and eat him. Nothing happened, of course, aside from his fingers getting thoroughly covered in cobwebs. He gingerly grabbed the small corner of the paper and pulled it out from the tape recorder. The side he saw was blank, so he turned it around and felt his heart drop into the tunnels below him. Second time's the charm, John. A.C. The note fluttered to the ground as John felt his entire body go numb. She knew. The fucking web knew. And they were taunting him. He gritted his teeth as his nails pierced the skin of his palms, droplets of blood splattering onto the floor beneath him. He gritted his teeth and seethed as his entire body trembled. They were going to do it again. They were going to hurt everyone again for their stupid fucking plan. But John wouldn't let them. He played right into their hands once, but not again. Not fucking again. He looked at the tape recorder. It was a trap. It was so obviously a trap. And yet he found he didn't give a shit as he grabbed it and the note and stormed back into his office. Did they want to play games? Well, John was going to give them a fucking run for their goddamn money. He wasn't a naive idiot like the last time. He knew the stakes. He knew the rules. They weren't going to win. But if he wanted to stop them, if he wanted to preserve the smiles on Tim, Sasha, and Martin's face, if he wanted to preserve Melanie's life from getting ruined, and Daisy from falling to the hunt, if he wanted to stop Annabelle Kane and Jonah Magnus and Peter fucking Lucas, he needed power. And he knew exactly how to get it. Ripping Annabelle's notes into the smallest pieces he could before sprinkling them like confetti directly into the trash. Then he turned his attention back to the tape recorder. Violently destroyed the bow as it too joined the garbage and pressed record. Elias, hopefully if you're reading this, it means that I found a way to record these troublesome statements I mentioned to you this morning. I found this old tape recorder in document storage, wrapped in a bow. I assume it was a gift from the previous head archivist, Gertrude Robinson. Or maybe it was from her? I don't know. Either way, I'm going to try recording that difficult statement I mentioned, just to see if it works. John took the anglerfish statement out from the drawer in his desk that had collected a few statements over the last few days. He took a deep breath as he looked at the words. There would be no going back after this. No, there was no going back a long time ago. Now he just had an extra push. Statement of Nathan Watts regarding an encounter of Old Market Close, Edinburgh. Original statement given April 22nd, 2012. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins.